Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar, Cross-Platform Development with Xamarin. My name is Spencer and I'm a developer here at Latitude.
My name is Jeff. I'm also a developer at Latitude.
And we are super excited to talk to you today about Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms. So let's dive in.
So what is Xamarin.Forms? It's a framework for cross-platform development. You can write your applications in C# and you can compile them for iOS, Android, and UWP. Big benefit of this is that if your developers already know C#, then they don't have to learn anything too scary.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how you can just know .NET and then you can be creating an iOS app pretty easily. Xamarin is preferred for Windows development because it supports UWP, obviously, and that means you can run your applications on Xbox if you wanted to. A bit of a sacrifice, though, is that you sacrifice some of the platform-specific paradigms, and you end up creating apps that are pretty uniform, but Xamarin still takes care of some of those platform-specific aspects. And so then what is Xamarin.Forms? So Xamarin.Forms is the UI toolkit that comes with a collection of cross-platform widgets. And these are like things like text boxes, text, buttons, drop-downs, just number sliders, those kinds of things. And this allows you to create a shared code base for the entire application. And so instead of just business logic, you're also saving implementing UI code across platforms, which then means less code to maintain and test.
But at the same time, if you need to write some platform-specific code, you totally can. And you might run into issues where you want something to look slightly different on a different platform, so it's handy to be able to write that platform-specific code.
Yeah, so it totally gives you that flexibility to be able to make those decisions when you need to, but otherwise, sometimes like text is text, and as long as it's using the right font for the platform, it's cool.
So Esri has the ArcGIS runtime, which supports Xamarin.Forms, and it provides a set of reusable GIS components that you can use to build a GIS app. So it provides basic things like a map view and a scene view, and a huge benefit is that you can just create one app and deploy it to the 3 different platforms.
So yeah, it's cool that Esri also recognizes Xamarin.Forms within their development and create these like awesome, you can just throw in a map into your application, no problem, and it's you can use it along with other Xamarin.Forms components. So just a couple notes, we're going to go into a demo on setting up a basic Xamarin.Forms project right away, but there's a couple of specific things when you're setting up your project in Visual Studio. Typically, in our case, a Xamarin.Forms solution has 4 projects, and so if you're developing for each platform, you'll have an iOS, an Android, a UWP, and then you also have one project containing a shared code, containing the shared code. And so this can be a .NET Standard library or just a shared project, which will then compile into each of the iOS, Android, and UWP applications. Very important is that the iOS project needs a Mac for compilation, so you have to have a Mac if you're creating these cross-platform apps and you want to target iOS.
The great thing is you can just connect Visual Studio from your Windows PC to a Mac and use it as a build server, so you don't actually have to switch computers to do development. You can just connect remotely, and you can even use the simulator remotely from your Windows PC as well.
Totally, yeah. Or you can also hook in an iPad and just kind of run it off that too. So but you have to have it connected even if you just want to be building the app and making sure that it can compile. And then there are emulators provided in Visual Studio, like what Jeff was saying, for all platforms. Once again, still need that Mac to be connected if you want to be building iOS. And we found that debugging with UWP is the simplest dev experience because you can just really easily run your app as a Windows desktop app. And so it's just kind of running within an app on your local machine. And this is very nice and allows for a really quick development process. But
running it on UWP, you can kind of run into some pitfalls because you end up running it only on UWP, and you end up with a great UWP app, and you haven't tested your iOS and Android apps enough. So it's important to make sure you're testing it on every platform.
It's almost too easy.
Yeah, it's too easy.
So we're just going to go into a demo on setting up that basic Xamarin.Forms app using the Esri Runtime SDK and just creating a little simple cross-platform app.
So here we are in Visual Studio with a typical Xamarin.Forms solution. So you can see there's 3 projects, one for each of the different platforms and one project for shared code. So if we look at the NuGet packages for each project, you can see that we have Xamarin.Forms installed in each one of the specific projects. So Android has Xamarin.Forms and UWP has Xamarin.Forms, and they both have a reference to the Esri ArcGIS runtime for Xamarin.Forms. So if we run the app, we're targeting UWP right now, so this will just be running on our local machine. So you can see we have a nice simple app here with a map at the center and a draw button. So if we hit the draw button, we hit a point, and then we put another point, you can see the distance at the bottom is listed there. As we add more points, the distance increases. If we hit clear, it clears the distance and we can draw another shape. So just a super simple app that uses a map. So we can run the same app on Android. All we have to do is switch the Android project to be the startup project and then target the Android emulator, which we already have running. So if we hit play, and since you're deploying to an actual emulator, it might take an extra second. So you can see it's essentially the same app, but on Android. You still have the draw and clear buttons, so if you draw, you can see that the distance is updated at the bottom there. So yeah, it's really powerful. You can write one app and have it deployed to 2 different environments.
Yeah, some kind of minor details that are probably hard to pick up in this app, but the draw buttons are slightly more rounded, kind of how you would see in a typical Android app, and Xamarin.Forms just takes care of that for you. So kind of that simple native styling comes out of the box for you. And then you can see how we're using the Esri Runtime SDK map view in all of these, and it all looks the same. And yeah, just slight adjustments made for each platform, and that's really cool. It kind of saves you some time in those aspects.
So let's take a look at the code here and see what we actually have. So you can see each one of these projects has a main activity. And if you look in the main activity, it's basically just starting up the app. All of the actual code for the UI and the business logic all lives in the shared project. So you can see how this could be pretty powerful. So if we look at our shared main page XAML file, you can see the layout of the app here. There's 2 buttons at the top. You can see the Esri map, really easy to reference the ArcGIS runtime and bring a map view into your project. It's just a one-liner. And then we have the 2 labels for the distance. So if we actually take a look at the code behind, it's pretty simple. So we have a couple of button handlers and event handlers, and yeah, you can see it's just really, really simple. So every time the button's clicked, we want to start capturing geometry, and when we clear, we stop capturing geometry. And every time the geometry changes, so we add a new point, we calculate the length of the line using planar Cartesian coordinates, and we set the distance of the line to be to this property, which is actually data bound to the label. So you can see this property is called distance, and we look in here and we can see that this label is data bound to the distance property.
So you can totally see how you could just jump in as a C#.NET developer, and suddenly you're creating these platform applications, and you have the XAML kind of like familiar format with the code behind and the data binding and everything like that. So very cool how much you can do with just like a few lines.
Yeah, we'll pick up on this demo in a bit.
So that is how you create a simple Xamarin.Forms app and add the ArcGIS runtime to it and deploy it into multiple platforms. So where we've been using Xamarin.Forms ourselves is in developing a .NET version of Geocortex Workflow 5.
So what is Geocortex Workflow 5? It allows you to automate guided end-user interactions by dragging and dropping pieces of business logic and hooking them together with transitions. And this allows you to avoid writing custom code in order to have custom functionality in your applications.
So yeah, it handles kind of upgrades and everything in the ArcGIS platform and allows users to kind of just focus on the bits of business logic at hand, and we call those bits of business logic activities, and you can just drag and drop in a web user interface for that. And so Geocortex Workflow, like we were just saying, it has this web version, and in Workflow we have these form elements that you can kind of combine together and add forms into your business logic so that users can be guided.
So the forms are implemented with React, because this is the web version, but obviously we can't use React in .NET. The workflows can also be run in either Web App Builder or our viewers.
And like we were just saying, we're soon to have a .NET version coming out, and these workflows are going to be able to run in our next generation mobile viewers. And these forms are implemented with the Xamarin.Forms. And so kind of bringing it all together, this is what Jeff and I have been working on recently with our coworker Darren. Hi, Darren. And so now we're going to give you a quick demo of Geocortex Workflow and in both the web and the mobile version. So here we are in the Geocortex Workflow Designer. I have designed a workflow already, and this workflow is in charge of drawing a feature on the map based on where a user clicks on the map. And so I have this display form, which is where all of our form elements are configured, and I have a text box for adding a point, and then this is called our geometry picker, which lets the user pick a point on the map, and then a submit button. Very simple, very straightforward. And so this will take that input from the display form, create a symbol from some JSON, create a feature, and add that feature to the graphics layer. And so I'm just going to run this workflow in Web App Builder. And so I have a little app I've already made, and I will click on the workflow widget, and we can see kind of that form element that I had just created. It says add a point. I'm going to add a shape, click on a point on the map, and submit. And I get this lovely pink square. And now I'm going to open up our mobile viewer. And this is a very bare bones Geocortex mobile viewer that's currently in development. And I've configured a run workflow widget over here, and I'm going to click it. And we can kind of see that there's the same form elements that was in the Web App Builder version. So we have the title, it says add a point, and then click add shape. I can add a shape, I can click on the map, I can click submit, and I get my great pink square. Cool. So now where the power of having this in both versions exists is that I can go back to my workflow, and I can go to my display form, and I can write a different title. How about we'll just do a small change. A bit more informative title maybe. I'm going to save it in the designer. And if I return back to my Web App Builder application, I'll just refresh it so it can pick up those changes. And if I run the workflow, my title has now changed to a click to add a point. And once again, I can still add a point and submit.
You can see how it's very powerful that you can add custom functionality to your applications without having to do any coding whatsoever.
And then similarly, I have my mobile viewer. I'm going to click run workflow. And now it also says click to add a point. So it also picked up the change. And both Web App Builder and Geocortex Mobile Viewer are consuming the same workflow, giving me my pink square once again. So yeah, that's kind of what we've been working on, is adding this bit of these form elements and this functionality to the mobile viewer, and all implemented in Xamarin.Forms.
Yeah, so that was a demo of how to use workflow in web and how you can use the same workflows in our new mobile viewers. So let's dive into a little bit more of the stuff we've been doing lately with the implementation of the .NET version. So we are using workflows to implement some of the new features in our mobile viewer. And as you can imagine, that's going to save us a lot of time, because instead of writing a bunch of code and having to test it, we can just configure the functionality in the workflow designer. So in order to display those forms in the mobile viewer, we had to create a set of reusable components. The components are often made up of one or more Xamarin.Forms components. So for instance, you could have a component that's made up of a text box and a couple of labels or anything else. And you can see how that would be pretty powerful if you wanted to reuse that component over and over again.
And in that, we created some more complicated components as well, such as like the geometry picker you saw in our demo. That integrates with the ArcGIS runtime, that integrates with, we're creating buttons and labels, everything around that. It's raising events and drawing points on the map when the user clicks on it and everything like that. So it's pretty cool how much like you can combine all these things together and create something really powerful.
So for the most part, we stuck to Xamarin.Forms code only, but occasionally we did have to write some platform-specific code just to ensure that everything worked properly and looked all right across all the platforms.
So like in certain paradigms in iOS, you might not want to have a checkbox. You might want, or if the way like date pickers are displayed and everything like that, there are so many different ways you interact with an app on a different device. So sometimes if Xamarin.Forms didn't give us that functionality, we'd have to add it ourselves, or if we were combining multiple Xamarin.Forms elements, sometimes we'd have to do those things ourselves and make decisions about what we thought or what made sense for every platform.
So we're going to do a demo for you now on reusable custom components, and these were really useful for us because, as you could see from the mobile viewer, there was a set of components on a panel on the left-hand side, but we wanted to make our forms consumable in any manner, so they could appear in like a custom widget anywhere within the viewer. So we had to make them fully reusable so that you can just consume them and the application decides where they're going to be displayed.
Right, without knowing necessarily where a user will configure the form elements, how many form elements they'll put together, if it will take up the whole page or if it will just take up part of the page. So they just had to be really flexible. So let's go into that demo.
All right. So here we are back in Visual Studio. You can see now I've added a second Xamarin.Forms project. It's called DevNR2, and as you can see before, it's got one project for each of the specific platforms and one shared project. And this project is where our reusable components are going to live, and they're going to be consumed in DevNR project number 1, which is where the application lives. So these projects, they don't actually output an application, they just output a library. So if you can't run these, they're just libraries that are built and consumable from these projects. So I'll give you a quick demo here. So you can see this looks fairly similar to our first demo, except now in the bottom we have a drop-down box which allows us to pick the units that the distance is going to be displayed in. So if I draw a line on the map, See, it's displayed in kilometers, but maybe I want to display it in meters or miles or feet. So what's going on here? So this component in the bottom is a reusable component that's built in Devinar project number 2. So as you can see, these are tied together. The drop-down box is tied together with the label, and this whole part here forms an entire reusable component that we could, for instance, use anywhere. We could put another one up here if we wanted. So
distance everywhere.
Yeah, distance everywhere. So let's look at the code and see how we do that. So in the shared project for Devinar 2, we have a XAML file, and it's just a custom content view. And as you can see, it's got a label, which is the distance label, and it's got a picker. And the picker, you can see, is configured with the different unit options. So then this custom component can be referenced in the application. So if we look in the application, the main page, one thing I should mention is just to note, this custom component is called multi-unit display, and it's in Devinar 2. So if we look at the XAML for the main application, you can see we reference Devinar 2, the namespace Devinar 2. And then when we're putting the custom component into the application, all we have to do is say Devinar 2, the namespace, and the name of the component, which is multi-unit display. And that's all we have to do to bring that label and drop-down box into our application.
And so it's the same kind of configuration that we're using to add the Esri map view. And then also we can access this multi-unit display in the code behind, and we're doing that to
set the distance of the display. So let me show you that. So if you look at the code behind here, important to note, the name of this is distance display. So in the code behind, you'll access it from the property called distance display. So if we look at the code behind, now when we set the distance, instead of setting the property called distance that was on this main page, we've now removed that because we don't need it. We set the distance property on the distance display element. So if we go back and look at the code behind for the distance display element, you can see it has a distance property. So basically the distance property just moved from the application to this custom component. And that's all we have to do in order to create a reusable component.
And so yeah, in Workflow we're doing this to configure colors, labels, any kind of content that's being displayed within our own custom form elements. And so this is very powerful to just be able to simplify, as we love to do with libraries and everything like that, to just simplify that experience from the viewer standpoint. When you're just developing the application, you don't want to worry about too many details. You just kind of want to set the properties that you care about, and then otherwise just kind of keep it on.
So here's our new application, also running in Android. You can see it's got a native Android picker. So instead of a drop-down, it's actually an Android picker. And you can still choose the units. And you can still see the distance being calculated there. Yeah, so this is just a demo on the power of reusable form components and how you go about configuring them in your project structure.
So yeah, that's basically kind of how we went about doing our Geocortex Workflow .NET implementation. Many details were missed, but for the general idea, like that's kind of what we were trying to do, and in that made it possible to create reusable form elements. And so for both of us, this was kind of our first time even delving into anything really UI related. We were both kind of more in the back end side of things, and so that was an interesting challenge to learn in itself.
For sure.
And in terms of Xamarin.Forms and mobile app development, we learned a lot as well, but we found it pretty easy to dive into and kind of start. You can see how easy it is to start making an application, so it's really easy to start playing with everything and learning from there. So a few challenges that we encountered were handling the differences across platforms.
So you're building a cross-platform app, but obviously there's going to be some differences across platforms. You want to figure out what the app should look like on each platform. For instance, as Spencer mentioned, with the text boxes and sliders on iOS, checkboxes aren't really a thing on iOS. So typically, in a scenario where you have a checkbox in an application, if you're running it in iOS, you probably want to use a slider.
And we found sometimes within Xamarin.Forms there were events weren't always being raised the same way across platforms. So when you were clicking on, there's a number incrementer form element, and when you were clicking on the incrementer to decrement the number counter, in Android, the event would be called all the time, and it would be called way less frequently within UWP. So you had to kind of like play with things a lot to experience and see kind of like, when will this get called, and making sure that your logic and your form is dynamically updating as you need it to, and dealing with those situations.
So another large challenge we had is that when you're making custom form components, obviously when you use them in an application, you want them to look like the application. So they have to be able to inherit a style from the parent application somehow. So the big challenge was making the workflow form components look like our mobile viewer. So in order to do that, we had to expose some properties on the form components, things like background colors, padding, margins, just so that they look like they belong in the viewer.
But then it was also a balance of making sure they're not too configurable and only exposing what we needed to expose, just to make it a simpler configuration experience, and finding out like what we're able to make consistent across platforms, because for some form elements, setting a color will set a different part of the element, and so just really knowing those elements. But as you could see in our mobile viewer that we demoed, it was consuming that styling. It was all kind of that dark theme, and it looked fairly integrated into the application. And
so margins and spacing sort of goes along with that. Like it has to fit the look and feel of the parent application.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that like you don't want to expose too many margins or spacing, because sometimes weird things can happen, and you don't want to give too much freedom, but you want to make sure that you can be letting those things be exposed where it makes sense. And so it's kind of a trial and error thing a lot of the time, I feel, for us.
So we learned a lot while implementing Workflow 5 for .NET, and so we're just going to go over a few of the things that we learned. So one big thing that we learned was you can run into roadblocks pretty easily using Xamarin.Forms if you're trying to write very platform-specific stuff. It's really designed to build simple apps across platforms. So if you want to do really platform-specific stuff, you're going to need to write some platform-specific code. And in some scenarios, we tried to avoid doing that as much as we could, and we ended up with some kind of ugly workarounds. So in hindsight, it's probably better if you need something to work different on a different platform, it's okay to write platform-specific code. Like it's not too hard. It doesn't end up adding that much code to your project, and it'll end up being a lot more maintainable, and it'll look a lot better.
And you're already saving yourself so much work by sharing whatever you can. For instance, all of our form elements have a title and a description, and we just integrate that into every single one we're developing, and we've kind of just, not having to write that every time, or not having to deal with that for every platform, saved us a lot of time. And any of the very simpler form elements are pretty out of the box, and so you still save a lot of time by just sharing some of your UI code even. Definitely try it on real devices as much as possible. Emulators are really great, and they can create a good development experience, but you can think your app is working when it might not be. And explore testing tools sooner than later. So right now we're exploring this application called Browser Stack, which lets you test on a bunch of cross-platform devices, and really easily just run your app on any kind of device.
Yeah, you don't want to fall into the trap of only testing on UWP, because as we mentioned, if you're only testing on one platform, even though the app's supposed to be cross-platform, you're going to end up with an app that looks really good and works really good on one platform, but then you might be surprised you go to another platform and there's just something slightly different that doesn't work quite right. So you're definitely going to want to test on as many devices as you possibly can, and if you can write automated tests and use testing tools, the more the better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rotating between all devices is probably the best strategy.
Yeah.
Definitely plan for the styling of each component up front. We didn't really think too much about styling at the very beginning. We kind of thought we could just do it afterwards, but we definitely would have saved some time if we had just done more of that planning up front and kind of made sure that every component was being designed for each platform. So if we were using sliders when we needed to for iOS, or we were, just kind of like considering all those things.
Yeah, it was something we kind of had to refactor and bolt on at the end, because it sort of became apparent that the styling that we had wasn't going to be quite enough to make it look nice in our viewers. So yeah, that was definitely something you want to consider from the start of the project, is where your components are going to be consumed and what kind of styling are they going to need to inherit.
But yeah, definitely something you can add on afterwards, but just makes your life easier if you do it more up front. And finally, embrace XAML. We did a lot of code in the code behind, which was kind of great for what we were normally used to writing, because neither of us are UI developers. But it would have been a lot probably easier afterwards to kind of read how every component was set up if we had just used a bit more XAML and taken advantage of that, because it's something that's there for you.
Yeah, XAML totally gives you a pretty good visual outline of what your form component is going to look like. You can also take advantage of things like data binding and converters to really enhance it and make it pretty powerful.
But overall, we're pretty pleased with how things turned out. We managed to match a lot of the functionality of Geocortex Workflow wherever it made sense, and kind of taking those React components and translating them to this native platform was an interesting and exciting project. And yeah, we're excited to kind of see it more in the viewer.
Totally.
Less code behind, the better. And so that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for watching.
I hope this was helpful to anyone who's exploring Xamarin or exploring using the Esri ArcGIS runtime.
Yeah, overall, I think we would recommend it. It was a good experience. So
Totally.
Yeah, thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.